If you've been told that cutting out salt is the fix for your high blood pressure, you have been given the least important piece of a much bigger puzzle. And that one mistake is why millions of people cut back on sodium and watch their numbers barely move. In this video, we are breaking down three powerful natural methods that directly address the root causes of high blood pressure. First, magnesium, the overlooked mineral that helps produce compounds to relax and widen tight blood vessels. Second, potassium, the essential nutrient that signals your kidneys to flush out extra sodium while calming your nervous system. And third, a 4 to 6 breathing technique, a zero-cost physical hack that activates your vagus nerve to lower stress in real time. For a huge number of people, cutting back on salt barely scratches the surface, and sometimes it points them in the wrong direction entirely. You can skip the salt shaker entirely. Order the low-sodium option whenever a menu has one. Read every nutrition label like it was a legal document. And every single time you go in for a checkup, your blood pressure can still sit stubbornly in the danger zone. It is not about being lazy about health or not trying to do everything right. Doctors often keep nudging medication dosages up instead of down, and people can't understand why cutting salt harder and harder isn't making a dent. Turns out, most people have been solving the wrong problem the entire time. Salt was never really the issue, and once you understand why, you'll understand something almost nobody explains clearly. The real drivers of high blood pressure usually have nothing to do with your salt shaker at all. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. In a healthy body, eating salt raises your blood pressure temporarily because sodium pulls extra water into your bloodstream, increasing blood volume. But healthy kidneys sense that shift almost instantly and flush the excess sodium and water right back out through urine, bringing your pressure back down on their own. No drama required. That's why some people can eat a salty meal and barely notice a change, while others are far more sensitive. Salt sensitivity genuinely varies, a lot from person to person. So when blood pressure stays high, even after someone cuts sodium hard, that's actually useful information. It means the problem was never the sodium itself. It's how the body is processing everything around it. And that's exactly where the real culprits start showing up, the ones that rarely get mentioned in a rushed 10-minute appointment. The first one is a mineral. Almost nobody gets tested for magnesium. Magnesium helps your body produce compounds that relax and widen blood vessels. And when magnesium runs low, those vessels stay tighter than they should, forcing your heart to work harder just to push blood through them. Here's the wild part. Research suggests a huge chunk of adults simply don't get enough magnesium from their diet, and studies looking at large groups of people have consistently found that lower magnesium levels line up with a higher rate of high blood pressure. A big reason this has become so common comes down to what's actually on our plates. Refined grains, sugary snacks, and heavily processed meals are all naturally low in magnesium, and eating a lot of sugar makes your body flush out even more magnesium through urine, digging the hole even deeper. On top of that, modern farming has pulled minerals out of the soil faster than they get replaced, so the same vegetables that were a solid magnesium source decades ago often contain noticeably less today, even if the label looks identical. The most reliable fix is prioritizing magnesium-rich foods like leafy greens, legumes, nuts, and dairy. And for people who are still falling short, supplementation is genuinely worth a direct conversation with your doctor, since the right dose and form can depend heavily on your individual situation and whatever else you're already taking. Now here's a hormone that almost never shows up on a standard blood panel: insulin. When insulin levels run chronically high, which is common in people dealing with insulin resistance or prediabetes, your kidneys respond by holding on to sodium instead of releasing it. That happens even if a person hasn't touched their salt intake at all, which explains why blood pressure often improves once insulin levels come down, sometimes before any real weight loss even happens. This is exactly why cutting back on refined carbs and sugar can move the needle on blood pressure more than salt reduction ever will. Sodium might cause a short-term spike, but it's persistently high insulin that turns that spike into a permanent chronic condition. Insulin resistance connects to another sneaky factor most people have never heard of: fructose, the sugar used heavily as a sweetener in processed foods and drinks. When your body processes a lot of fructose, it produces more uric acid, and elevated uric acid interferes with nitric oxide, the compound your blood vessels rely on to stay relaxed, while also making those vessels stiffer and making it harder for your kidneys to clear out sodium. Cutting back on processed sugar and fructose tends to improve insulin resistance and uric acid levels together, and that combination alone has brought blood pressure down meaningfully. For a lot of people, though, anyone already on medication should only make that kind of shift with their doctor's guidance, never on their own. Notice the pattern here. High blood pressure is almost never about one single mistake. It's usually a stack of smaller physiological stresses piling on top of each other for years, quietly. Which brings us to potassium, a mineral that works on two completely separate fronts inside your body. In your blood vessels and kidneys, potassium helps vessels relax while telling your kidneys to release extra sodium, directly counteracting the retention problem we just covered. In your brain, rising potassium levels help calm down your sympathetic nervous system, your body's fight or flight response, which is one of the exact systems responsible for pushing blood pressure up under stress. Here's the catch. A typical modern diet is basically the opposite of what supports healthy blood pressure: low in potassium and high in sodium. And that imbalance alone can push your numbers up even when your total sodium intake doesn't look particularly high on paper. Good potassium sources include potatoes and sweet potatoes, tomatoes, cucumbers, and other vine vegetables, leafy greens like spinach, and legumes like chickpeas and beans. And a lot of these foods happen to be solid magnesium sources too. So you're covering two problems with one grocery list. Sleep is another piece that gets wildly underrated. Sleep apnea specifically is a major driver of high blood pressure. The repeated pauses and breathing throughout the night put real measurable strain on your cardiovascular system, and treating it, often with a CPAP machine, has been shown to meaningfully lower blood pressure in people who actually have it. Chronic stress plays a nearly identical role, keeping your body locked into a state that constricts blood vessels and activates the same hormonal pathways responsible for raising blood pressure under pressure, quite literally. A sedentary lifestyle compounds all of this on its own. Our bodies were built to move regularly, and skipping that movement is an independent risk factor, completely separate from diet. And then there's sunlight, which sounds almost too simple to actually matter. But sunlight hitting your skin triggers the release of nitric oxide stored there, which helps widen your blood vessels, alongside supporting vitamin D production, both playing a real supporting role in healthy blood pressure. There's also a genuinely useful tool that costs absolutely nothing and takes just a few minutes: a specific breathing pattern. Breathing in through your nose for about 4 seconds and out slowly for about 6 seconds. Repeated for a few minutes. Activates your vagus nerve, the longest nerve in your body, running from your brainstem through your heart and major organs. Your vagus nerve fires strongest during exhalation, which is part of why slow, extended exhales have a genuinely calming blood pressure lowering effect, and part of why people in a panic or under acute stress tend to breathe with short, shallow exhales, the exact opposite pattern. This same technique can be used anytime stress spikes, not just as a scheduled daily practice. Now, let's put actual numbers next to these interventions because the picture becomes pretty compelling once you do. Research on the DASH eating pattern, which emphasizes fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, and less processed food, shows it can lower blood pressure by around 11 points on its own, landing in a similar range to what many standard blood pressure medications achieve. Regular exercise produces a meaningful reduction as well. Magnesium supplementation under proper guidance has shown small but real reductions in clinical studies, and getting enough potassium through diet shows a comparable effect. Even lowering sodium intake shows a measurable benefit, though it's worth being cautious about cutting it too aggressively, since going too low brings its own problems, including muscle weakness and fatigue. Some research has also looked at garlic and hibiscus tea, both showing modest reductions in certain studies, though those effects vary more between studies than the bigger, better established factors like potassium, and magnesium. So it's fair to treat them as helpful extras rather than the centerpiece of a strategy. None of these numbers mean any single change is a magic fix. They mean the pieces genuinely add up when combined, which is exactly why addressing root causes tends to outperform chasing one intervention in isolation. It's also worth understanding where blood pressure sits on a much longer timeline than most people realize. Long before someone gets diagnosed with hypertension, their arteries are already becoming stiffer, and by the time a diagnosis happens, that process has usually been building quietly for years. Some clinicians consider prehypertension a genuine warning sign rather than something to simply wait out, since it reflects where someone is heading, not just where they currently stand. The vast majority of high blood pressure cases are labeled essential hypertension, a clinical way of saying the exact cause was never pinned down. And part of that gap exists because the overwhelming majority of hypertension research funding goes toward pharmaceutical interventions rather than lifestyle and root cause factors, which naturally shapes what gets studied and what eventually gets taught to your doctor. None of this is a reason to dismiss medication. For people who already have significant arterial stiffness or organ involvement, blood pressure medication can be genuinely necessary and life-protecting, and stopping it abruptly can be dangerous. But for people earlier in that process, there's real value in addressing insulin resistance, magnesium and potassium status, sleep quality, stress, movement, and sunlight exposure before assuming medication is the only road forward, ideally alongside a doctor who's willing to look at those pieces too. Addressing the missing pieces, like optimizing magnesium and potassium intake or treating undiagnosed sleep apnea, can lead to significant improvements under medical supervision. The bigger takeaway across all of this is that high blood pressure is rarely about one mistake or one missing nutrient. It's usually several smaller physiological stresses compounding on top of each other over years, which also means there's rarely one single fix. It's the combination of several smaller corrections that tends to produce the biggest results. If you're dealing with elevated blood pressure yourself or supporting someone who is, the most useful first step isn't necessarily a new prescription. It's a closer look at these underlying pieces: insulin, magnesium, potassium, uric acid, sleep, stress, and sunlight, and an honest conversation with your doctor about which of them might actually be driving your numbers. None of these changes require an overnight transformation, and that's genuinely the point. Small, steady corrections in a handful of these areas tend to compound over weeks and months, in a way one dramatic change rarely does. And that compounding effect is usually what separates people who see lasting improvement from people who just bounce between quick fixes without ever touching what's actually going on underneath the numbers. If this actually helped connect some dots for you, hit subscribe, because we're breaking down one root cause like this every single week.